I have two texts this morning. One comes from 2 Samuel, the other from Luke, the Old Testament and the New. There is a connection between the two of them, of course, and we'll look at that this morning just a little bit. But we're going to focus mostly on the New Testament, but I want to set this up a little bit with the Old. King David had already built himself a palace. They had fought their fights, battled their battles. They had gotten to the promised land. They had settled, and things were peaceful. He had built this huge palace out of very expensive cedar wood. Very expensive cedar wood. And I picture him sitting around one day in his beautiful palace, looking out of the window and seeing how beautiful everything is, and then realizing, this guy that led us through all this is still in a tent. Something wrong with this picture. Just, kind of an afterthought, if you will. After took care of himself a little bit, built that nice palace out of all that good cedar wood. And so he's going to build a temple for God. And he says something to Nathan, the prophet, and Nathan is sure that God's blessing is with him. And he says, God's with you in all that you do. Go and do it. Build that temple. But that night, Nathan had a dream, had a vision. God spoke to him and said, it's not going to happen. Tell David not to do it. Is David the one to build me a house? Tell him not to do it. And I thought about that, and God promised David instead that he would make David a house. Now, he didn't mean he was going to build him a palace to go with his palace that he already had. He wasn't going to give him a summer place down south or anything. It was the fact that he was going to make of him a house that we talk about, like in England in those days, the house of yore, a people, a lineage that would last forever. He was going to make him his birth line a house that would last forever, a lineage that would last forever. And of course, we see that in Jesus. But the point that I want to make on the Old Testament is that David was sure he knew what he wanted to do for God. He's sure he had the plans already made. He knew he was going to make that palace. It was kind of an afterthought. It was with his leftover stuff, but he was going to make him a palace. And God's plan for David was completely different. I think that's true of us in the church, maybe in our own lives. We make these plans, these wonderful plans for God. We decide what wonderful ministries we're going to start so that we can bless God. And we forget to sit back and listen and hear where God is at work. What God wants us to be about. And worse than that, we do it with what's left over. We've already paid the electric bill. We've already bought the food. We've already done the Christmas shopping. We've already spent all of our money except whatever little bit's left over. And, oh yeah, God's still in the tent. Maybe we ought to do something for God. And so we make our plans in the leftover. And usually it's something simple or easy, something that's not going to pressure us too much, because we do have a lot of work in family ties and things that we've got to get done, and all this 7 or 6 day a week stuff. So we don't want to put too much pressure on ourselves and do something very difficult and hard and complicated for God. There might not be enough time. So we take the easy road and don't take too much risk. And then we flash forward to Mary. Think of what she risked. Can you imagine this young girl? There's estimates of her age, knowing how young girls were when they got married. And I say girl on purpose. Girls were when they got married in those days. Between the ages of 10 and 14, they were usually married. And so she was somewhere between the age of 10 and 14, no doubt, engaged to be married, but she was not married. The culture was very strict about unwed mothers and about having any kind of sexual relationships outside of marriage. She was risking a lot. She wasn't taking the easy way out. She wasn't giving God what was left over, but she was giving God what was first. And she was risking everything. No matter how hard or easy her life would have been without this complication, if you will, without saying yes to God, saying yes guaranteed that her life is going to be much more difficult. Her life is going to be much harder. The baby she was carrying, God told her was to be called the Son of God. You know the only other person that was being called the Son of God back then? Does anybody know? Again, not a rhetorical question. Come on, Bob, you do the Greek stuff. what king? Was it really a king? The emperor. Yes, the emperor. That emperor worship had just begun shortly before this time period. And the emperor was being worshipped as the Son of God, as deity. So this was not only a challenge to the people of the temple, to the scribes and the Pharisees, to the priests and the Sadducees, this was challenging Caesar's realm as well. To be called Son of God was to be a pretender to the throne of Rome. Not just messing with those who were the religious experts and leaders of the Jewish religion. This was a dangerous burden and task that Mary was saying yes to. It's kind of different for us, I think. Many of us still think that saying yes to God in our lives will somehow make our lives